Story 1. My late husband was involved in a car accident during his senior year in 1986 and received a $30,000 settlement he could access at the age of 18. He was a car enthusiast and wanted to buy a Corvette, but his mom didn't like the idea. She made him a deal. If he bought the car, he'd have to pay rent and storage for his other cars, or he could buy property and live at home rent-free for as long as he wanted. So, at 18, we started looking for property, and he ended up purchasing 10 acres for $5,000. We planned to either build there someday or sell it later. In the early years, we threw huge parties on the land. There was no one around to bother, and it was great. As time passed, more people bought and built houses on the lots around us. Zoning laws changed, allowing one house per acre, so several homes popped up. It was still rural, and those of us with large, empty acreage let the local kids ride their dirt bikes. We didn't mind, it was all in good fun. About 15 years ago, a new house went up right on the property line, and before construction was even finished, the wife started calling, demanding I cut down trees that were supposedly blocking her view. The funny thing was, her view was from an RV they were living in at the time. Once they moved into their house, the trees wouldn't even be near their view, so I politely declined. Over the next few years, she continued to complain about various things, including the noise from the kids riding dirt bikes. She even got upset about people riding horses nearby because it made her dogs bark. One spring day, I drove out to the property and noticed the stream that ran across my land and hers had been dammed on my side and diverted about 50 yards from their property line. This created a pond and prevented me from accessing most of the land. I knew they were responsible because earlier that year, she had called to complain that my stream was causing her property to flood. It wasn't my stream, and her land wasn't flooding, it was just the natural flow during wetter months. They had cleared all the trees from their lot and done extensive grading, so if they had water issues, it was their fault. The following weekend, we brought a small backhoe and a few friends to unblock the stream. Before we could even start, she came out screaming, and the cops showed up. The officers weren't sure if we were allowed to redirect the stream, or if the neighbors had done it illegally, so I was prepared. I had brought pictures showing how the stream had originally flowed, and one of our friends, who worked for the Department of Environmental Oversight, explained the law. We had the legal right to restore the stream's original path. While we couldn't do much about the pond except wait for it to dry up, we returned the stream to its natural course, which unfortunately flooded their yard due to their grading work. The DO official issued them a citation for illegally diverting the stream, and they were forced to restore the stream bed and plant native vegetation in a 25-foot buffer zone, taking away part of their yard. They had to pay us damages and were fined heavily. As the summer went on, the kids on dirt bikes discovered the new pond, which was about 18 inches deep. They loved riding through it, and soon they spent hours there, much to the neighbors' annoyance. She called the police multiple times, but the kids always had permission from us, so the police couldn't do anything. We were aware of the potential liability, but honestly, we enjoyed aggravating her, so we took the risk. Thankfully, no one got hurt. A few years later, she learned to text because we ignored her calls. One spring, I visited the property and found that 23 large cedar and fir trees had been cut down, with 5 already chopped up and the rest leading directly to her full woodshed. I was furious. "You don't mess with my trees." I called the police, and their excuse was that they needed firewood as their sole source of heat, and they cut extra wood so it would dry out for future use. They were charged with theft and vandalism and received another no trespassing order. It took a couple of years, but they were ordered to pay $10,000 for each tree, and we sold the remaining 15 trees for another $45,000. Needless to say, they were not happy. Life went on, and we continued to receive texts whenever something irritated her, whether it was dirt bikes, horses, or just about anything else. We started hosting summer campouts, and every time, she called the police or fire department. But we never got cited since we didn't break any laws. Sadly, my husband passed away suddenly, and eventually I decided to sell the property. I wasn't going to build a house there, So I listed it for $1 million, which was the market rate at the time. Of course, she tried to sabotage the sale by telling potential buyers that the land flooded and other nonsense. But developers weren't discouraged. While I received offers slightly below asking, I wanted to sell to someone who would build a single home. It was a sentimental decision, and my agent wasn't thrilled, but he understood. One day, my agent called with an offer that was significantly lower than the others. The couple wanted an owner-carried contract for 3 years, with a balloon payment at the end. We agreed to meet at the property to discuss the offer, even though I wasn't too keen on it. When I arrived, the neighbor was already there, telling the potential buyers how awful the property was. As I approached, 2 kids came speeding up on dirt bikes, and she lost it. She picked up a rock and threw it at them, though she missed by a wide margin. The man started yelling at her to leave, which she eventually did. He apologized profusely, but I thanked him. He explained that they wanted the property specifically because their boys rode motocross, and he planned to build a track for them. That sealed the deal for me. I knew he was the right buyer. I accepted the lower offer and carried the contract, just to spite the neighbor. While the sum I accepted was much less than the market rate, it didn't really matter to me. We had bought the land for $5,000, made nearly $300,000 from the trees and damages, and enjoyed the property for 30 years. Plus, I received interest on the contract and the balloon payment. Most importantly, I knew the neighbor would be miserable for years to come. That was 6 years ago, and I still visit the property a couple of times a year. The new owners have built a beautiful house far from her property, and there's a massive motocross track near her place. She still sends me nasty texts, and while I probably should block her, it brings a smile to my face knowing she's still upset. It was worth every bit of the loss, and I know my late husband would have approved. He always knew I had a petty streak. Story 2. This story begins in 2013 when I landed my first job in healthcare, working in human resources for a facility. It was a part-time job with on-the-job training, which felt like a dream for someone just entering their 20s. Before this, my experience was mostly in fast food and customer service, so I was thrilled to finally get my break. On my first day, I met my new boss. She seemed pleasant enough, and I didn't have any reason to worry. She was happy to have an employee, and I was eager to learn. I quickly mastered the paperwork side of the job within a week, and she expressed how impressed she was, encouraging me along the way. However, things took a turn. The first signs came in the form of small comments about how tiny I was and how she could just pick me up and throw me. As time went on, her remarks escalated. She started saying things like, "You only got hired because you're cute and young." For context, my boss was a straight woman. She found different ways to criticize me for being slim, attractive, and young. Then, she began blaming her work errors on me, though it usually backfired. Our office was small, with her desk facing the back of my head, so it felt like she was always breathing down my neck. After about a year, I'd had enough and quit the job, moving into a completely different field. Later, I found out she had been a new administrator herself, with no prior employees, as she had just finished her degree. I had been her first chance to play boss. About a year after I left, the new administrator called me and offered a better position with higher pay. I asked if my former boss still worked there, and that's when he told me the story. She had been escorted off the premises after it became clear she wasn't doing any of her job duties. Both the administrator and she had been let go, but only she had been physically walked out. It didn't go well. The administrator knew I had left because of her and wanted to offer me the position because of how well I had performed. I accepted and worked there for another year before moving on to an even better opportunity. Life was going well until a few years later. I had been in a new position at an unrelated nursing facility for about 2 years, part of the interdisciplinary team, and in a leadership role. Then, out of nowhere, she appeared this time, not as a boss, but as a nurse. This was completely unrelated to her previous degree, but there she was, working at my new job. Karma, I thought. Despite our past, I decided to let bygones be bygones. Years had passed, and I figured we could both be adults about it. I wasn't her direct supervisor, but I was her superior. Things were fine for about a month, and then the issues started. My employees began receiving odd warnings from her about how they were doing things wrong, but only on my days off. And so, the battle began again. But this time, I was more experienced and knew how to handle her. Over the next year, she tried to undermine my employees and department at every opportunity, but each attempt backfired. Eventually, she lost her privileges to supervise her own certified nursing assistants due to her antics. Fast forward to the present, 4 years into this job. About a week ago, I accepted a new position with a highly reputable company that is training me to become the next regional general manager of administrators. This opportunity will not only make my career, but also pay for my education and training at a well-established company. Now, for the sweet moment of revenge. Op equals sign me, Karen equals sign her. In the company smoking area. Me. It's crazy to think we've worked together for so long now, right? 5 years on and off. Karen. Yeah, we've seen some things together. Me. I remember you had just graduated back then. That was your big break, wasn't it? Your kids were finally in high school, and they were doing so well. She had never told me this, I heard it through the grapevine. Karen. Yeah, that was a waste of $60,000. I could never find another place that would hire me. She had messed up the last company so badly it sold 8 months after I quit, and the new company had hired me back. Me. Oh, I always wondered why you went back and got your nursing degree. I already knew she had been shunned from jobs dealing with finances. Karen. Well, I had to pay off all that debt and help with my kids' college. So, nursing seemed like the right choice. I had been a CNA for years before finishing my bachelor's. Me. I thought your son dropped out, and the other one ran away to his dad's. Also, you're $80,000 in debt now, right? Karen. Who told you that? Me. Doesn't matter. I'll see you inside. Before this conversation, I had sent out a mass message to all my employees and colleagues, many of whom I knew personally from a fundraiser I had organized. By the time Karen followed me inside, I was being congratulated left and right for my new position. This gave me the perfect opportunity to share all the details of my amazing career move right in front of her. For the next 20 days, I would have the pleasure of relishing in these moments, as my facility required a 30-day notice, and I was well known throughout the company. Let's recap some facts. Karen has $80,000 in debt, plus her kids' debt. She has 1 failed bachelor's degree and a marginally successful certification. She has no supervisory roles left and few prospects. Her actions caused the last company to shut down, making her unhireable in that field. Meanwhile, I started this industry with no formal education, no student loans, and am financially stable before the age of 30. I'm about to start a program that will pay for my master's degree and position me to control the region within 2 years. In less than 6 years, I've surpassed her financially, and in a few more years, I'll be her boss's boss's boss. Life is good sometimes. Not bad for someone who was supposedly hired just for their looks and youth. Story 3. This happened about 5 years ago. I'm a mailman, and my route consists of a single stop with 65 community mailboxes for a large gated community of 800 houses. Each community box has between 8-16 individual mailboxes, 1-2 lockers for parcels, and an outgoing mail slot. There's a master lock on each box that allows me to open the entire front of the unit and access all the mailboxes inside at once, which saves me from having to open each one individually. The boxes are arranged in 4 rows, and it usually takes me about an hour to deliver to each row. Since I'm paid by salary, not hourly, the faster I get done, the more per hour I earn. This motivates me to find ways to save time. One method I use is splitting the mail into 4 sections, 1 for each row, instead of bundling mail for each individual box. I then open all the boxes in 1 row, deliver the flats, magazines, legal envelopes, etc. then the letters, followed by the packages. Once done, I lock the row up and move on to the next one. I've been doing this route for 20 years, so most of the residents know me by sight. I'm friendly with a few, and whenever someone I don't know approaches me while I'm working, I have some simple rules to share. 1. You don't reach into any mailbox that I have open. If you need your mail immediately and can't come back later, just let me know which box is yours, and I'll close it so you can unlock it yourself. 2. I won't deliver out of order, no matter how big of a hurry you're in, because all the mail comes in a specific order. 3. I don't allow children near any open boxes, because kids tend to grab things, and I've learned that from experience. I think these are reasonable rules. Now, enter Karen. You know the type: a bit overweight, bleach blonde bob, pantsuit, and shoes that likely cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She walks up to me just as I'm unloading the mail from my truck and demands to know which mailbox is hers. She doesn't provide her name or address, just demands to know. You might wonder how she wouldn't know her own mailbox, but when there are 800 mailboxes in 65 community boxes, it can be a bit overwhelming for new residents. I needed to ask her a few questions to help her, so I started by asking, "Have you received your set of mail keys yet?" She responded, "I don't see how that's any of your business." I explained that I needed to know if she had her keys so I could decide whether I needed to grab my lock change kit and give her a new set. She finally admitted that she had her keys. Meanwhile, her son, who looked about 8 or 10, started picking through the mail I had already unloaded. I have kids, so I know how to talk to them. I calmly told him he needed to stop playing with the mail. Not loudly or harshly, just firmly. That's when Karen exploded. She started screaming at me, telling me I had no right to order her son around like that. When she finished her tirade, I explained that tampering with the mail is a felony, and as his legal guardian, she would be held responsible if he didn't stop. She made a half-hearted attempt to tell him to get away, and he went off to play nearby. I got all her information and showed her which box was hers. It was in the last row, so I told her I wouldn't get to it for a few hours. She opened it and found the mail that had been piling up since she got her keys. She started flipping through it to make sure it was all hers. I keep meticulous records, and I had been forwarding any mail addressed to the previous resident and delivering anything new for her. However, there were no ads in the box yet because I don't start delivering weekly ads until someone has picked up their mail for the first time. Ads can pile up quickly, and it's just easier to wait. When she realized there were no ads, she completely lost it, accusing me of stealing her mail and threatening to report me to the postmaster. Ironically, the postmaster had trained me when I first started. He was the one who taught me to handle new residents' mail this way. I asked Karen if she wanted his phone number, but she started yelling at me for being sarcastic. While this was happening, her son started messing with the mail again. Since this was his second warning, I was much sharper when I told him to stop, and he started crying. Full-on sobbing like a 4-year-old. I was shocked a 10-year-old crying like that over being told no. I figured this kid had never heard the word no in his life. Karen then screamed, "How dare you yell at my baby? Don't you know who I am?" and slapped me across the face. I've been hit before, but this slap caught me by surprise so much that I actually saw stars. I didn't think that was a real thing until then. I was raised to never hit a woman, so I restrained myself. But I told her that if she hit me again, I'd call the police and press assault charges. I also told her again to keep her boy away from the mail. She then threatened that if I called the police, she'd accuse me of trying to assault her. I replied sarcastically, "Have a nice day," and turned back to my work. She didn't leave, though. She stood a few feet away, glaring at me as if she was going to wait the 3 hours it would take to get to her mailbox just out of sheer spite. I didn't let it bother me and went back to work, starting on the first row of boxes. Her son came over again, this time keeping a respectful distance. I didn't mind him watching as long as he kept his hands to himself. Kids are curious, and they're often fascinated by how the community boxes work. I told him he could watch but reminded him to stay back. Thankfully, Karen didn't hear me, or I'm sure she'd have thrown another fit. When I finished the first row, I glanced over and saw Karen still standing there, glaring at me. Her son looked miserable. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't just go home and come back later. What did she think she'd prove by standing there watching me work? Before starting the second row, I called my supervisor and explained what had happened. She advised me to film Karen if she approached me again, so I'd have video evidence in case things escalated. That advice ended up being crucial later. I went back to work and opened all the boxes on the second row. This time, her son got bolder. He came right up to me and reached into one of the mailboxes as I was placing a magazine inside, as if he was going to grab it. I quickly grabbed his wrist, pulled his hand out, and pinned it to his chest. I told him very sternly that if he did that again, there would be consequences. What did he do? He reached back into the box, pulled out the magazine, and tore it in half. I'd had enough. I lost my temper and started yelling at both him and Karen. Karen came storming over, yelling back at me. I pulled out my phone and started filming her. That's when she went berserk. She flipped all my trays of mail over, scattering letters and packages everywhere. She reached into open mailboxes, pulling out mail and throwing it on the ground. All of this was happening while I filmed, trying to stop her. She kept saying, "Don't you dare put your hands on me, or I'll scream assault." Then she pulled out her phone and called the police, telling them that the mailman had tried to force himself on her and she needed officers immediately. She said this while I was filming everything. It was like she wasn't even living in reality. Then she stood there with a smug smile on her face, as if she had won. I stopped filming and called my supervisor, who immediately called both the police and the postal inspectors, who handle all mail-related crimes and have the same authority as us marshals. My supervisor arrived first. I showed her the video, and she started tearing into Karen, not even letting her get a word in. Karen kept trying to accuse me of assault, but my supervisor held the phone up to her face and said, "Yeah, right, it's all on video." Then the police arrived. They looked around, clearly confused by the mess of mail, my supervisor yelling at Karen, and Karen's kid happily opening as many packages as he could get his hands on. I hadn't even noticed that until then. The police initially wanted to cuff me since they had responded to a reported assault, but my supervisor showed them the video and explained what really happened. Then the postal inspectors arrived. They are no-nonsense professionals with zero tolerance for mail crimes. After reviewing the video, they took my statement, and Karen was arrested for tampering with the mail and allowing her son to open mail that wasn't addressed to them. It took 4 other mail carriers to help clean up the mess. We were there well after dark, sorting everything out and making sure all the mail got delivered. Several residents gathered to watch, and some chatted with me about what had happened. It turns out, many were well aware of how difficult Karen could be. Karen went to trial. I testified, and in the end, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison and fined $250,000. As for me, I got a week off work to recover from the stress. Let this be a lesson. No matter how angry you are, or what you think you're doing, you do not mess with the mail. You will go to prison for it. Story 4. This story begins in 2013 when I had my first encounter with an entitled parent and her child, and my faithful dog ended up playing a major role in their eventual arrest. This took place in a beautiful, sun-soaked southern state, where I lived in a charming little house surrounded by tall fences. The front fence was 10.5 feet high, the side fences were 8 feet, and the back fence was a 10-foot chain-link barrier. I was fortunate enough to work from home, so my office was a pleasant patio unless the weather had other ideas. My companion at the time was a German Shepherd Rottweiler mix named Sorry. At just 1 year old, she was a big presence, weighing 120 pounds. Despite her size, she was a sweet and gentle dog, although she had a fiercely protective side. Sorry was well trained, but she had a mischievous habit of wandering off to play with other animals, so I kept her on a leash when we were outside. There was an alleyway behind my house that local high school students often used as a shortcut to and from school. Many of them would stop to say hello to Sari and give her some attention, which she loved, and I didn't mind at all. However, not all of the students were kind. Some would shake the back fence, throw things at it, and yell at Sari whenever I wasn't around. They were always gone before I could catch them, leaving me feeling frustrated and worried for my dog. To deal with this, I installed security cameras and made sure Sari was always with me when I had to step inside briefly. One day, while retrieving something for work, I heard the familiar sound of the fence rattling and Sari barking angrily. Rushing outside, I saw a group of kids, one of whom was attempting to throw a rock at Sari. Furious, I hurried over to my dog and calmly asked the ringleader, "Did it ever occur to you why I keep my dog chained up in a fenced yard?" Then I unhooked her leash. Sari darted to the back fence, effortlessly climbing over it and chasing after the group. The kids scattered, running down the alley with Sari barking fiercely at their heels. I let her chase them for about half a block before whistling for her to come back. She returned happily, tail wagging, and I checked her over, relieved that she was unharmed. A few hours later, one of the kids returned with his mother, the entitled parent. She stormed toward me, shouting, "Your dog attacked my son. He was just having some fun, and you scared him. It was just a joke. I'm calling the police, and they're going to shoot that dog." She ranted on, not giving me a chance to respond. Tired of her threats, I decided to call the police myself. The dispatcher could hear her screaming in the background, even though she was a good 40 feet away from me. Within minutes, 2 squad cars arrived with 4 officers. 2 officers approached me, while the other 2 spoke to the entitled mother and her son. She continued her tirade, peppering her words with profanities. I calmly explained the situation, showed them the video footage from my security cameras, and provided Sari's vaccination records and proof of her training. I requested that charges be filed against those involved. Meanwhile, the officers were petting Sari, who was happily soaking up their attention. We walked over to the other group, with Sari on her leash, staying about 10 feet away. Suddenly, Sari stepped in front of me, growling and showing her teeth, her back fur standing on end. It was a frightening sight, and I knew something was wrong. The entitled mother screamed, "See that? She raised that dog to attack people. Racist." This accusation angered me, but I ignored it and called one of the officers who had been speaking to me earlier. I whispered to him that I suspected either the mother or the child might be carrying a weapon, which was why Sari had reacted so protectively. This wasn't the first time she'd done this, and I trusted her instincts. The officer took my concerns seriously and decided to search both the mother and the child. To everyone's shock, they found an unregistered firearm on the mother and a 6-inch switchblade on the child, both illegal in our state. In addition to the charges of animal cruelty, they were now facing charges for carrying concealed weapons, possessing a firearm while on probation, resisting arrest, and more. Even as they were being arrested and driven away, the entitled mother continued screaming. I highly doubt that's how she or her son thought their day would end. As for me, I never saw them again, and the harassment towards Sari finally stopped. Thanks to my loyal dog, justice was served, and peace returned to our home. Story 5. When I was about 11, I lived in the rough part of Quincy, Massachusetts, with my dad. He wasn't the best guy. My mom was never around, and whenever I asked about her, I got the same response: "She's a crazy woman." My dad had his vices. His biggest one was cigarettes. He smoked constantly, like they were the only thing keeping him from losing it completely. When he ran out of money, though, cigarettes became a problem. Even back in the late 80s, they weren't cheap. When things got tight, he'd send me out to bum cigarettes from the neighbors. Some of them would hand over a few without a word. Others told me how terrible it was for a father to send his kid to beg for smokes. A few even threw things at me, like chicken bones. What was I supposed to say? "Ma'am, I'm 11. I didn't even know how to react half the time. When things got really bad, he'd make me walk around town, looking for cigarette butts that still had a little tobacco left in them. I can't tell you how disgusting that was, but I got good at it, which was even worse. I hated it. One night, I was in the middle of a game of Monopoly, playing with my action figures when my dad barked at me to go on another cigarette mission. I was fed up. I argued, but he wasn't having any of it. He threw a handful of dirty coins at me and yelled, "Don't come back until you've got cigarettes I can smoke." His voice was all raspy from his surgery, making it sound even more threatening. As I picked up the coins, one of them, this little dime, was smeared with blood from where one of the coins hit me. I just stared at it, thinking about how sick I was of all of this. I was 11. What could I do? But then, an idea came to me. One last option. I started walking. It was dark, and I knew where I was going. I ignored every cigarette butt on the ground, even saw an uncrushed pack. But I didn't care. I wasn't bringing anything back. I was heading for the payphone at the fire station. My dad always told me not to call my Aunt Stella, but that's exactly what I was going to do. I dialed her number, and when she picked up, she knew something was wrong right away. I broke down and told her everything. I told her about the cigarettes, about how my dad treated me, and things from the past that I hadn't even realized I was holding on to. The worst part came out too, the things he'd done to me when I was younger, back when I was still his type, as he called it. It all just spilled out. Aunt Stella didn't waste any time. She told me she was coming to get me, and she meant it. She showed up fast, a pack of cigarettes in hand. When she got to the house, she told me to stay in the car, and I did. Even through the closed windows, I could hear her yelling, "Here's your damn cigarettes, I'm taking him with me." The saddest thing, my dad just took the cigarettes without saying a word. No argument. He didn't even try to stop her or fight for me. And as much as I hated him, I think part of me wanted him to. Aunt Stella called the police right after that. My dad went to jail, and later, he moved out of state. Turns out, I wasn't the only kid he'd hurt. More came forward after I did. He was done for. I went with Aunt Stella that night, and I never looked back. Well, that's not true. I look back every day. Story 6. Back in 2005, I switched jobs and landed a gig that came with an amazing perk. 3 months working in Spain, all expenses paid. At the time, I was living in Argentina, so this was a dream come true, getting my usual salary plus an incredibly generous daily allowance, all while having the opportunity to visit Europe for the first time. The only downside? The project I was assigned to was a complete nightmare. The consulting company that hired me had overpromised on a massive bank project, leaving us with an impossible deadline. That's why they flew me out. It was an all-hands-on-deck situation. When I got to Spain, the working hours were absurd. We started at 9 a.m. and rarely left before 11 p.m. some nights. We stayed until 1 or 2 in the morning. I wasn't too bothered by it, though. I was living in a hotel, didn't know anyone in the city, except my coworkers who were in the same boat, and we all bonded over the craziness. My colleagues were great. They were determined to make sure I didn't burn out. They'd always say, "We work like crazy Monday through Thursday, but Friday afternoon, you're heading straight to the airport to explore Europe. Don't worry about us, we'll manage." The real problem was, as always, the project manager. We called him Soran. He was one of those middle management types who lived and breathed the company. He'd boast, "I started working for this company, met my wife through this company, got married because of this company, got divorced because of this company. I live for this company." You get the picture. Since the hours were so brutal, and we were always exhausted, the tech team minus Soran started this informal routine. Every day around 9:15 a.m., we'd head to a nearby cafe to grab a solid breakfast and plan out the day. It became our impromptu morning meeting, with the team leaders included. It worked well for us. Then came the day things hit the fan. Soran and I had a meeting with a client at the office. During the meeting, the client casually asked Soran to get something done by the afternoon. Soran said, "Sure, I'll just head down to the team and get it sorted. Be right back." He left the room, and I figured he'd return in a minute. But he didn't. The meeting ended, and Soran never came back. I walked down to the bullpen after a couple of hours, and to my surprise, no one was there. Not Soran, not the team, just an empty room. Then I heard yelling coming from one of the meeting rooms. I opened the door and found the entire team shouting at Soran, and he was shouting right back. Apparently, Soran had found out that the team had gone to the cafe as usual that morning, and he was furious. The team, on the other hand, was livid because they'd been working ridiculous overtime without complaint. Soran yelled, "I don't care. You're hired to start working at 9 and you need to be at your desks on time. That's what we're paying you for." One of the team leaders, realizing this was going nowhere, calmly said, "Okay," and ended the meeting. Soran spent the rest of the day in meetings, probably trying to recover from the mess. But then something unexpected happened. At 7 p.m. that evening, we all left. We'd been working way beyond our contracted hours for weeks, so we decided to follow Soran's advice. We worked the exact hours we were being paid for, nothing more, nothing less. The next day, we did the same thing. And the day after that, for an entire week, we clocked out at exactly 7 p.m. Sora, of course, missed a few important deadlines and got chewed out by the client and his bosses. He quickly realized he'd messed up. By the end of the week, he became oddly quiet, no longer complaining about our cafe meetings or the occasional long lunch. We still worked plenty of extra hours to meet the project's demands, but after that, the atmosphere was way more relaxed. And Soran, he made a point to spend as little time in the bullpen as possible,